I want to dedicate this shir in memory of my father, Zichron Livracha, who passed away on the 6th day of Iyar, and it should be an Ilui Neshama. Today I have Yartzeit for my father. So we're on Daf Lamed Daled Amid Beis, and we're up to the top line on the Amud, moving fast towards the Mishnah. The Gemara says the following. On the previous Amud, if you turn back for just a moment, we had a machlokes between Rebbe and the Chacham. And this is a machlokes about how to interpret the psukim with regard to the two karbonos of the Tamid shel Shachar and the Tamid shel Bein Harbaim. And we said the following. We had a brisa that interprets the pasuk of V'nisko Revius Hahin Lakeves HaEchad. We say in Karbonos every morning from Parshas. And we're not sure, this is going to be a machlokes, how to interpret this pasuk. Are we talking about the Tamid shel Shachar or the Tamid shel Bein Harbaim? So we said that if we assume that when the Torah says La Keves HaEchad, the keves of this is, of course, the korban tamid, and it needs v'nisko, it needs a nisuch hayayin. Are we talking now about the keves of the tamid shel boker or of Bein Harbaim? The Chachamim are of the opinion that the keves about which the Torah says bring the nesachim is the Tamid shel Bein Harbaim. And the reason why the Chachamim say so is because if we read the whole pasuk, it says, Es hakeves echad taseh baboker, es hakeves hasheni taseh Bein Harbaim. And then a few psukim later, it says, B'nisko revi'is hahin yayin. So from the sequence of the psukim, it would certainly indicate that the pasuk about Nesachim is connected to the very last of the Tmidim, meaning the keves of Bein Harbaim. And that's called in the language of the Chachamim, Yilmad shel Shachris mishal Arvis. That the only time the Torah explicitly mandates bringing a Niskei Yayin is only the Tamid shel Bein Harbaim. We're going to have to assume that whatever took place and was required with regard to the Tamid shel Bein Harbaim is required in the Tamid shel Shachar. So the Melamed is the Tamid shel Bein Harbaim. The Nilmad is the Tamid shel Shachar. Rebbe Omer, and this is where we stopped on Yom Chamishi, on the top of Daf Lamed Daled Amid Beis, that no, that Arvis Mishal Shachos, that when the Torah speaks about Niskei Yayin, it's referring not to the Tamid shel Bein Harbaim, but rather to the Tamid shel Shachar. And on the contrary, from the fact that the Torah requires Niskei Yayin in the Tamid shel Shachar, ipso facto, we're going to derive the conclusion that the Tamid shel Bein Harbaim also requires Nisuch Hayayin. Bishleim el Rabbanon. Hi, b'Tamid shel Bein Harbaim ksuv. The simple reading of the psukim would certainly support the position of the Chachamim, because after the Torah says, Es hakeves hasheni taseh Bein Harbaim, then it follows with the Nisko Revius Hahin, requiring Niskei Yayin. And since the pasuk is referring to Niskei Yayin of the Tamid shel Bein Harbaim, we can only derive the conclusion that Tamid shel Shachar likewise requires Niskei Yayin by equating it to the Tamid shel Bein Harbaim. But the Mefurash, What's explicit in the Torah is that Niskei Yayin are required for the Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim. El Rebbe, but Rebbe says that on the contrary, the Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim is derived from the Talmud Shel Shachar by time. Why should we assume that when the Torah says V'niskor Revius Hayayin, it's referring to the Talmud Shel Shachar? That's antithetical to the sequence of the Psukim. Because after the Keves HaEchad, the Torah goes on to say the Keves HaSheni, and only then does the Torah introduce V'niskor Revius Hayayin. Omar Rabba Bar Ula, Rebbe is going to derive his conclusion that the pasuk is referring to Talmud Shel Shachar. Why? Because Omar Kra, the pasuk says V'nisko, and then it says Revius Hayayin, and then it ends with Lakeves HaEchad. What does that mean, HaEchad? Right? Again, let's go over this. On the one hand, it says Vasakeves HaSheni Taseh Ben Arbaim, and then it goes on to say V'nisko Revius Hayin. But after V'nisko Revius Hayin, it says, what is this Revius Hayin accompanying? What generates the Revius Hayin? Lakeves HaEchad. What does the word HaEchad mean? Omar Kro, Lakeves HaEchad, Ezu Keves Shenemar Bo Echad, Hevi Omer Zeh Talmud Shel Shachar. Nowhere does the Torah use the terminology Lakeves Echad with regard to the Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim. The phrase Lakeves Echad is exclusively dedicated to the Talmud Shel Shachar, Shel Boker, because the pasuk says V'sakeves Echad Ta'aseh B'boker. When it gets to the Keves of Ben Arbaim, it says Hakeves HaSheni. It doesn't say Hakeves Echad. So now in the parasha of Niskei Yayin, when the Torah says V'niskor Revius Hayin Lakeves HaEchad, the Keves HaEchad is clearly referring to the Talmud Shel Shachar, which is in fact called in the very same pasuk. It's called as Hakeves Echad Taseh B'boker. So when it says V'niskor Revius Hayin Lakeves Echad, it's referring to that same Keves Echad, which is defined as Hakeves Echad Taseh B'boker. Now, according to the Chachamim, we don't need the pasuk to talk about Talmud Shel Shachar, because this pasuk is a hemshech of V'sakeves HaSheni Taseh Ben Arbaim. So when it says now V'niskor Revius Hayin, it's referring to the Keves HaSheni Shetaseh Ben Arbaim, to the Talmud Shel Shachar, Shel Arvis, Shel Ben Arbaim. So then why does the Torah confuse us and add this ambiguous phrase at the end of it is V'niskor Revius Hayin and say Lakeves HaEchad, which, as Rebbe insists, is referring back to the Talmud Shel Shachar? Rabbanan, my Echad. What is the Torah saying with this completely redundant phrase, Hakeves HaEchad, which according to Rebbe is not redundant at all, because the Torah wants to tell you that the Talmud Shel Shachar requires Niskei Yayin, but according to the Rabbanan, the pasuk that requires Niskei Yayin is referring specifically to the Talmud Shel Ben Arbaim. So why did the Torah add this? Confuse me, so to speak, by adding this absolutely superfluous phrase, Hakeves HaEchad. Comes the Rabbanan, and they say that this is teaching us a halacha, not only in Korban Tamid, but a new principle in Kachim, a universal principle in Kachim. And when I read this Gemara, I'm reminded of Parshas Bereishis. It says, my Echad. What does this extra word Echad mean according to the Chachamim? Miyuchad shebe'edra, which means a behema muvcheres. You have a choice of many animals to bring on the Mizbeach. Choose the choicest animal. In other words, in all mitzvahs, we have a principle called Avivus HaMitzvah. Right? We have Hidur Mitzvah, we have Chibuv Mitzvah. We're going to try to bring the best, get the best esrog that you can afford within certain limits. and make sure nobody destroys your esrog. So that's a limit. But with regard to kosher, there's a special halacha called halakeves ha'echad, which means b'muvchar shebehemos, whereas the Gemara calls it b'muvchar shebeidra, b'yuchad shebeidra. And this is a halacha of b'yuchad shebeidra that's derived from es hakeves ha'echad. Now, this drush that we're learning here in the name of the Rabbanan appears also elsewhere in a Tosefta in Masechet Menachos in the 9th chapter. And in the note here, he points out that if you read the Tosefta carefully, this is halacha in Karban Tzibur. We don't know yet about a Karban Yochid. Tosefta goes on to say that this halacha of Muvchar or Miyucha Shebe'edra applies even to a Karban Yochid. But keep in mind that the source is this word hakeves ha'echad, which seems to be halacha in Tamid. Tamid is a Karban tzibur. The tzibur that has access to the funds of the Trumas Halishka and to buy karbanos at tzibur should make sure that it buys the best of the best, grade A plus. But does that apply to a yochid? The Tosefta says yes, it applies even to a yochid who's bringing his own personal carbon. And the question is going to be, how do we derive that from Tamid, which is a Karban tzibur? In any event, the Gemara now it's a problem because the Rebbe uses the term keves echad to teach that the requirement of b'niskor revi'is ha'in is a reference to the Tamid shel Shachar. He doesn't have two extra superfluous words in the pasuk that give him license to derive this conclusion, which generates a new halach in kodshim of hamiyuchad shebe'edra. The Rebbe, from whence does he derive the halacha of hamiyuchad shebe'edra? The Gemara answers the. Now here there's a girsa problem. Let's leave out the parentheses, and instead we'll read the half square brackets. Midchar nidrechem. Now this is a pasuk in the 12th chapter of Devarim. I'll read the whole pasuk to you, and it says there v'haya makom asher yivchar Hashem Elokechem bo l'shakein shmo sham shataviu es or ace kol asher anochi mitzaveschem olosechem v'zivchechem masosechem usrumas yedchem v'chol mivchar nidrechem. And mivchar nidrechem means the best of the best. This pasuk has nothing to do with the Karban Tamid. It's in an entirely different parsha, but it's good enough for Rebbe to derive from this pasuk of mivchar nidrechem, the universal halach in kodshim that applies to all types of kodshim. The Torah delineates here in a long and enumerated list that require mivchar nidrechem. Nafka, therefore I can derive it from here. And in that case, we're stuck with the following question. The Rabbanan used this term, these extra words of hakeves ha'echad to teach us hamiyuchad shebe'edra. Why not derive it as Rebbe did from the pasuk mivchar nidrechem? Now let's just make one point. On the list of karbanos, which is delineated here in this pasuk, it culminates with mivchar nidrechem, but certainly we're referring to nidarim. And if we're referring to nidarim, then we have to be referring by definition to a karban yachid. There's no such thing, there's no entity of a karban tzibur that is a nidava. The tzibur is not going to pledge to voluntarily bring a carbon for the tzibur. So the Gemara says now for Rabbanan, why did they need the pasuk as hakeves ha'echad? Why not, as Rebbe derived this halacha biyuchad shebe'edro from the pasuk mivchar nidrecha? I need a pasuk of lakeves ha'echad bechov. In other words, if I'm obligated to bring a carbon, like the tzibur in the case of a carbon tamid, they have to fulfill that chova, that obligation, in the best possible way. And that's halachin kodshim. That we derive, say the Chachamim, from hakeves ha'echad. The chad, but the other pasuk of mivchar nidrechem, by definition, when you talk about a neder, is b'nedavam. A neder is a voluntarily accepted carbon. In other words, the chiyuv is generated by the fact that he took the oath, he took the pledge to bring this carbon. Okay, so how do I know that even in such a case where I'm not obligated to bring the carbon, nevertheless, once I take it upon myself to bring the carbon, and I took a neder and a davar, then I got to bring from the mufchar. For that, I need the pasuk mivchar nidrechem, that even though it's a neder and it's only a carbon and davar, nevertheless, it requires mivchar, biyuchar. And here we have a Rashi on the last word in this sugya, which is utrichi. Utrichi means we need both. We need to establish and derive the halacha of miyuchad shebe'idro for a carbon tzibur, and we need it for a carbon yom. We cannot derive one from the other. Rashi says, second line from the top, Yesh tzad noter shehanedova tzarech liapos, kidei shetisratze lidoron v'hakbolas panim. But v'yesh tzad noter lomer shehachova mutelis tzarech liforo lifroa chovo mishalim. Mishalim mushlam means a perfect. But Rashi, in his beautiful pedagogic style, clarifies why we need both. If we had only the case of an adov, I understand mivchar nidrechem, because you want to achieve ritzui from a carbon. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't ask you for this carbon. You know, we have so many psukim in Tanakh where the Navi says, "Mi bikesh sos miedchem." You know, I didn't ask you for this carbon. You want to bring a carbon? You better bring something that's absolutely beautiful, that could upgrade the status of this carbon adava to achieve ritzui on al gabi mizbeh. So there's a svara that is a compelling logic to require mivchar nidrechem. But if it's a carbon tzibur, which is a carbon chova, just bring the carbon. You know, one tle is just as good as another tle. So now I need another chiddush, that if I'm obligated in a mitzvah, in this case a carbon, then I have to do it in the best way possible. Why? Because I want to show HaKadosh Baruch Hu that I'm fulfilling His will. I'm implementing His chova. And in such a case, I need it mushlam, as Rashi says. I should do it in the most perfect way. What the Gemara doesn't do for us is turn send the ping pong ball, the tennis ball, back to the other court of Rebbe and ask, well, what's Rebbe going to do with the pasuk lakeves ha'echad? The answer that we know. But what we don't know the answer to is, if Rebbe needs lakeves ha'echad, he can't use it to derive the halacha of tzibur, of chova, then how does Rebbe know that the requirement of hamiyuchad shebe'edro applies even to a carbon chova? We know that Rebbe derived this conclusion, this halacha, the principle of bimivchar behemto. We know that he derived it from muvchar nidrechem. That's only nidrechem. That's only a carbon nidava. From whence does Rebbe know that the halacha requires muvchar, even in the case of a korban chova, of an obligation? What I think the answer is that Rebbe understood that in a korban chova like the tamid, we certainly require. If the entire tzibur is bringing a korban, so the necessity for this korban is one that's shared by the entire community of Israel. You want to bring the best that you can. The accomplishment, what's at stake here, is the entire tzibur fulfilling their obligation. Masha Einke, in the case of an adult, maybe the Torah doesn't require the muvchar. He didn't have to bring any korban. Whatever he brings, we're satisfied. We're happy with whatever you give. It's like, I don't know if this is a mashal that you can relate to, but if you're invited to a simcha, let's say a wedding or a bar mitzvah, you want to bring a gift that's mechubad, according to the standards of what you give. You go to a wedding and they spend 500 shekel per portion. You don't give a 2 shekel gift. But if you aren't invited to the wedding, you just feel for the simcha, and you want to give a gift, that's an adava. We're not going to demand if you were expecting you to give the most expensive gift. So that's why the Torah has to be machadesh, according to Rebbe, the mivchar nidrecha. But in the case of a korban tzibur, that is a fulfillment of the obligation and come upon the entire community, then we want to do the best we can. We don't need a pasuk. Now we go back to the dinim of Tvilas Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. The Mishnah says, Im Haya Kohen Gadol Zaken O Istanis. Now what happens is that, as you know, the Kohen Gadol has to be Tovel 10 times, 9 of which are the Kodesh and the Azorah, the Beis HaParva, the Gag HaParva. And the water sometimes gets very cold. Imagine dipping yourself into a mikveh if you're the Kohen Gadol and you're an elderly statesman, and you have to do it time after time after time during the course of one day. Or alternatively, you're an istanis. There's certain people who simply are their structure, they're built as such. They're not, tough guys that can jump into a freezing cold pool. They're an istanis. They're very sensitive. So either because of his age or because of his makeup, he is sensitive to the cold. So the Mishnah says that we heat up some chamid and we put it into the cold mikveh, and that removes at least the coldness of the mikveh. Again, it doesn't warm up the mikveh because we don't have a built-in heating system in this mikveh. But by throwing in this, call it a piece of metal that was heated up, it will raise the temperature of the mikveh. Tanya, we learned to the Brisa, Rabbi Yehuda, Ashoshios shel barzel, very thick slats of metal. And you and I know that metal is a great conductor of heat. We had this in Pesachim, if you remember, with regard to the korban Pesach, in the Shipud, right? That the korban has to be Sli Eish and not Sli Shipud. In any event, Erev Yom Kippur. Now again, on Yom Kippur itself, you would be violating a malacha of havara if you were burning a fire in order to heat up, these ashoshios shel barzel. But they heated up on Erev Shabbos. Are we out in the clear? Wait a minute. Umatilin l'sochat sonet. And then on Shabbos itself, I shouldn't say Shabbos, I should say Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur itself, we're going to take these ashishios shel barzel that are hopefully very, very hot and throw them into the mikveh. and the mikveh is cold, but now it's kedei to shetafik sinasa. It will take out some of that freezing cold temperature of the mikveh. Now this is also problematic. Like we said, you can't burn a fire in order to heat up metal on Yom Kippur. You got to do it on Erev Yom Kippur. How are you going to be allowing to throw a burning hot metal into the water that's cold on Yom Kippur? And that's called mitzvah. Let me try to, this is a sugya that we'll have to learn much more in depth, but let me just try to give at least a surface explanation of mitzvah. Back in the day, when they manufactured metal utensils, in the process of manufacturing, the metal was not solid. It wasn't yet, what word am I looking for? It wasn't solid. It wasn't stable. It wasn't strong and sturdy. They needed one last action to strengthen it. Al pi physics, you take metal and you heat it up in order to make it solid. And then the final makabapatish is to immerse it in cold water. Somehow in physics, I don't know how it works, but the contrast between the heat in the metal and the cold water in this case strengthens the metal. As long as it's burning hot, it's still somewhat pliable. At what point do you guarantee that it's absolutely solid? That's the moment that you put this hot metal into cold water. And that's the completion of the process of manufacturing a utensil. And the Gemara wants to know, when you take these slats of metal and you heat them up on Erev Yom Kippur, then you throw them into a cold mikvah on Yom Kippur, that's called mitzaref. Now, when you complete a utensil, the last segment of the process of manufacturing is called in Hilchos Shabbos, as you know, Makeh B'Patish. It's one of the 39 malachos. And the Gemara is asking, it's very nice that we want to, so to speak, warm up or take out some of the freezing cold of this mikveh for the sake of a zaken, a kohen gadol is a zaken, or an istanis. But you can't violate Yom Kippur with a malacha d'oraisa, which would generate a chiyuv kares, for the sake of warming up the mikveh. And now, by violating Meleches Mitzaref, and how so? Because as soon as you throw these slats of burning hot metal into the cold mikveh, it strengthens the metal, and that perfects the metal, and that's a violation of Mitzaref. Let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Halo Mitzaref, that 8 lines down from the top. Hanosein barzel min ha'esh lamayim mitzaref. If you take the barzel directly from the fire, and again, in this case, we must keep the barzel on the fire going into Yom Kippur, because otherwise it's going to cool off. And then it's not worth a dime. We need hot barzel. Is machazko umakshehu. I'm not sure why Rashi needs both these words, but machazko means it strengthens the metal, and then makshehu makes it hard. It's no longer pliable. So the Gemara says, how can we allow the violation of Asiyas Gemar Keli on Shabbos, in this case on Yom Kippur, and violate the malacha of Makeh B'Patish? It's impossible. Amar Bevi, Shelo Igia L'Tzeres. You know what? If you take a metal substance and you heat it, at some point it becomes so hot, it's like white iron. And then if you throw that into cold water, you mitzaref. Mechazkeu makshev. However, that's not what they did on Yom Kippur, but rather they heated up the metal, but not to the point of higil etzirus. It wasn't white enough or hot enough so that now it's ready to be thrown into cold water and be mitzaref. In other words, the utensil, before the mitzaref is effective by throwing it into cold water, it has to be on a very intense level of heat. I'm not sure what temperature, but you follow what I mean? Once it's very, very hot, then if you throw the metal into cold water, it's mitzaref. But not in our case of Yom Kippur. They didn't heat it up so hot that it would be subject to mitzaref as soon as you threw it into the cold water. He says the following. This is a summary of Rabbeinu Hananel and Rashi. He says, Habarzel, right? They heated up over coals. Boker Yom Kippurim, Yidela Tilon L'toch HaMikvah. Hein lo hayu chamos kishir shatalosam l'mayim techazik osam. They weren't heated up to that high degree that now it's subject to mitzvah. Ella, hein hayu chamos, they were hot. Kishir sheyafig es krius hamayim. They were hot enough to cool off. I shouldn't say to cool off, but rather to warm up the freezing cold water. Ela she'ein hayu chamos rak kishir sheyafig es krius hamayim ulefichach ein bozeh mishum mitzareh. Since they were only hot enough to warm up the mikvah, but they weren't hot enough to be subject to mitzareh, therefore they can do this on Yom Kippur for the sake of taking some of the frozen coldness out of the mikvah. Now, the real part of this sugya begins now, which we'll do tomorrow, and that is what's called the davar she'eino miskal. And the Gemara is going to offer an alternative to Rav Bevi. Rav Bevi says that the Mishnah was referring to a case of lo higil at seruf, and they prepared this hot metal, but not too hot, so it wasn't subject to mitzvah. But at this point, the Gemara is going to say, no. I grant you that it's really, really going to be hot, but it's a davar she'eino miskal. So bli neder, tomorrow we're going to talk about this concept called the davar she'eino miskal and how it kicks in with regard to mitzvah. A great day. Thank you so much.